Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. I just wanted to offer some reflections on the, I think, emphatically Ghazalian idea of the human embeddedness of philosophical choices and the way in which this inevitably opens up in our contemporary context and our supposedly postmodern context some questions that are actually quite classical to do with ego and self-control. I say Ghazalian because although we admiringly and in many ways quite worriedly think about the tight compartmentalization of his Sufi and Kalam epistemologies, separated out so forensically in the Iqtisad and his Minhaj al-Abidin, we have not sufficiently reflected on the way in which his final dismissal of the Avicennan project, with its point-by-point philosophical rebuttal of philosophical fallacies, begins with a spiritual diagnosis. He laments the way, and this is a neglected part of the Tahafut, but it is, in a sense, the key to all that follows. He laments the way in which religious indifferentism of many falasifa is rooted in a rejection of religious taqlid generated by another kind of taqlid. The falasifa, or at least Ghazali's contemporaries, students of Farabi and Ibn Sina, have been intoxicated by high-sounding names and by the show and status of the Arabized reception of the late antique symphony of Plato and Aristotle. It is ego, the Imam insists, that has led them to make their disastrously mistaken theory choices, rather than the intrinsic coherence of falsafa dialectics. The Kalam fightback against key falsafa masail, which follows Ghazali's Tahafut as its undoubted flagship, begins in his first muqaddimah with a diagnosis which is powerfully psychological and ethical. This pathologizing of a mistaken ratio recalls Foucault's famous seminar at the Collège de France, in which he dissects what he calls spirituality as the historic propedeutic to philosophy. Western thought began with the Delphic know thyself, and all previous generations of thinkers launched their philosophical lives in the context of a socially and institutionally mandated culture of self-knowledge and self-denial, so that the human subject would embark on its philosophical journey unencumbered by ego. This is emblematic of what we've come to call the late Foucault, a concern with the genealogy of our modern conceptions. It is, I suppose, a sort of phenomenology, but the epoché, the bracketing out required here, is not a Husserlian bracketing out of worldview, but of something deeper and more elemental, self itself. Foucault notes and almost proposes as a definer of our late modernity the pursuit of a philosophical project in a discursive, social and academic space which almost uniquely in history has allowed the discipline of self-abnegation to lapse, or at least to be thoroughly privatized. This was one of Foucault's late concerns. He found himself deeply dissatisfied with the way in which subjectivity was cultivated in the France of his time. Almost like Ghazali, he was, in the words of Paul Rabinov, on an increasingly articulate and acute quest for a form that would constitute a difference between what Foucault diagnosed as an impoverished modern problem space and a future in which things might be different and better. One might say that for Ghazali, like Foucault, philosophy chases its own tail unless the human subject is in some way delivered from its own vulgar reflexivity. In his famous period of doubt, in which even the viability of first-order propositions seemed to be fragile, the Imam nonetheless had access to a Khurasanian world of psychomacy and its masters, which, as he records, reinstated his access not only to God, but to the use of nazar. The late Foucault's unease about his thought environment was well placed, if slightly belated, but the cafes and bathhouses of his arrondissement could not provide the murshid who could open the way to a truly different mode of knowing. This insistence is, we might say, not parochial, but effectively universal. The basic religious commandment to know oneself is the foundation for intellectuality as it is for all else. World religions seem to converge on the understanding that the human creature contains not one but two selves. The first is the lower, passional, fallacious self, which Latin calls anima, and which is nafs in Arabic, nefesh in Hebrew, vedana in Sanskrit, while the second is spiritus, ruh, roach, or atman. The latter is not conditioned by time or space. We hence have no empirical experience of it. Liberation, or intellectual probity, is not about shaking off the physical body, oneself is not so easily escaped, but of shaking off all bodies insofar as these are subject to the world's gravity. The choice of the religious thinker is therefore between ourselves as we are in ourselves and to others, and ourselves as we are in God. Correct philosophy is thus rooted in a pre-rational, non-discursive relationship between ruh and nafs, which is hostile, adversarial. Everything which is subject to uncontrolled wants of any kind must be left behind. So Rumi writes of his sage, he has died to self and become alive through the Lord. Theology thus begins with a kind of coming to life, the life that is death to the self. Christian philosophers used to quote the passage in Luke's Gospel which holds that no one can be a disciple until he hate his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters. Meister Eckhart writes, as long as thou still knowest who thy father and mother have been in time, thou art not dead with the real death. In the context of our Ishmaelite religion, this absoluteness is not expressed in this way, of course. As Christian styles of monastic withdrawal from property and family, considered necessary by medieval European thinkers, were replaced by the prophetic model of what came to be known as al-khalwa fil jalwa. The Muslim theologian inhabits the heart of his society. Still, the Ghazalian, and therefore the later Sunni insistence remains on the death of self, because of the metaphysical understanding of the categoric otherness of the real. The hadith says, whatever occurs to your mind, know that God is other than that. Kalam apophaticism, in a sense, mirrors the self-denial which is already there in the theologian's soul. Perhaps it helps to remember a parallel to this distinctly unmodern perspective in the arts. Traditional sacred art typically ignored the artist or the craftsman. Anonymity, namelessness, is the quality of the Muslim who has naughted the self, and therefore the artist who provides guidance through his art will typically not even include his own name. Just as Scripture is truly God's, the personality of the human bearer having been eliminated, so sacred art is only authentic when the human bridge vanishes. So the art historian, Harold Swartzensky, observes, it is in the very nature of medieval art that extremely few names of artists have been transmitted to us. The entire mania of connecting the few names preserved by tradition with well-known masterpieces, all this is characteristic of the 19th century's cult of individualism based upon ideals of the Renaissance. And although, of course, in our Kalam tradition there are names to conjure with the exegetic accumulation, the names become little more than figures, and it is the tradition itself and its discursive accumulation of commentary and super-commentary that becomes the centre of our attention. Ghazali's contextualizing of Kalam within a broader religious and frankly spiritual system of moral and mental discipline thus ensures that for his theological vision the principle of self-knowledge and self-control is the first and necessary propedeutic. The word aql itself originally signified restraint, the hobbling of a beast, the first thing you need to do to it, to be able to control it. The discipline of Sufism emerged in part to provide formal mechanisms for the restraint of the beast of the ego, and Ghazali saw clearly how necessary this was for the performance of any objective theory choice in Nazar. Primal Islam had launched an integrative human project which united bodily functions through consciously practiced and assessed purity laws and rituals with social relations, political and economic life, formal worship, and the gifts of the spirit. As Ghazali reminded his generation, the purpose of every form of the revealed law was to uplift humanity by the remembrance of God. And this reminder, this dhikr, required a consciousness that was seen to be inseparable from the project of systematic theology. In the Ghazalian perspective, everything is theology. The Sufi tradition is in this sense the integrative point of departure for Nazar, whose great practitioners have always been advocates of Sufism of some kind. Of itself, Kalam, and also fiqh, cannot supply the processes of mental discipline necessary to its right pursuit. A syllogism may deliver ilzam correctly even in the hands of a villain. But there are many philosophical decisions to be made that rely on more human rather than purely computational dialectical processes. And Sufism can, as Sunni Islam generally concurred, manage to guide and save souls without the help of Kalam, whereas Kalam will never guide and save unless its practitioners have passed through the refiner's fire of self-naughting. This is why Maulana Rumi says in Book 5 of his Masnavi, self-existence brings terrible drunkenness. It removes intellect from the head and modesty from the heart. Lying in ambush, the intoxication of self-existence has waylaid 100,000 prior generations. Through it, a servant like Azazil became Iblis, saying, "Why should Adam be Lord over me?" It's almost talking about the modern academic environment. This drunkenness, supplied by the self, or the ego, which destroys both intellectuality and ethics, is here prefigured by Azazil's disobedience to the divine command to bow down before the creature that was made of clay. He offers a syllogistic argument, a classical piece of sophistry to show God the error of his judgment. I am better than him. You've created me of fire and him of clay. Why does he use this jadali response? Because, Rumi says, of his ego, or perhaps what Foucault would see as the form of his thought world. Unrefined, he reaches for an improper philosophical case for obeying his own pride and fiery nature. It is not syllogistics which are at fault, but their improper deployment by he who aba wastakbara, who refused and was vainglorious. What to do in the absence of a culture of self-naughting? Much philosophy today inclines to the alternative sort of grounding in community experience. Here, for instance, is Martha Nussbaum. Anglo-American moral philosophy is turning from an ethics based on Enlightenment ideals of universality to an ethics based on tradition and particularity, from an ethics based on principles to an ethics based on virtue, from an ethics dedicated to the elaboration of systematic theoretical justifications to an ethics suspicious of theory and respectful of local wisdom, from an ethics based on the isolated individual to an ethics based on affiliation and care, from an ahistorical, detached ethics to an ethics rooted in concreteness and history. The implications of this recent Western turn for Muslim theology are considerable and in many ways benign. Orientalism, of course, cannot use it. Aaron Hughes and other secular fundamentalists will cry out in pain when told that their insistence on a view from nowhere for a deliberate exclusion of one's own locatedness from the scholarly process is old-fashioned, and the apparently older religionists' insistence on pursuing academic theology within the template of a thought community in fact turns out to be better suited to the West's current secular mood. In fact, we might even be tempted to insist that religionists are better equipped to pursue rigorous scholarship, since, unlike their atheistic colleagues, their theory choices are, at least in principle, purified by a personal habit of self-knowledge, humility, and what our Imam would call muhasabah. This is one important implication of Foucault's moment of disillusion with Sorbonne philosophizing. Muslims would probably be tempted to step even further, using something like Charles Taylor's insistence that we cannot, in fact, manage without the process of the moral, since the human subject cannot be said to exist without its evaluative functions. Taylor writes this: "This is not meant just as a contingently true psychological fact about human beings, which could perhaps turn out one day not to hold for some exceptional individual or new type, some superman of disengaged objectification. Rather, the claim is that living within such strongly qualified horizons is constitutive of human agency, that stepping outside these limits would be tantamount to stepping outside what we recognize as integral, that is, undamaged human personhood. So there is no view from nowhere if we remain human thinkers and scholars, for not only is our belongingness to ummah and to madhab and to region and language part of what we are, it in fact supplies the only viable basis for assessing the meaning of things. Without it, Taylor says, there could only be meltdown. And we might add that in the context of the modern Ummah, without true belongingness to the set of moral horizons supplied by membership of fixed madhabs and the religious community as a whole, with stable local urf instantiations which framed the believer's moral universe, a psychic collapse would necessarily ensue. And indeed, this seems to be what increasingly we witness as the destruction of the former mental ecosystems in the Middle East trigger the emergence of excruciating and desperate pathologies of violence. Out of the water, a fish thrashes around. Certainly, it cannot do good theology. Islamic muhasabah might seem at first blush a simple variant on earlier discourses of self-naughting and moral community. Of course, the ego does not change any more than truth does. Aristotle's list of virtues and vices were not difficult to incorporate into formal Islamic ethics, any more than were, say, the Ten Commandments, if we accept the necessarily parochial case of Sabbath observance. But although Abraham's transcending of his own emotions at the binding of his son is a moment shared in principle by the three ways of the One, the three Abrahamic monotheisms, he binds for our memory in specifically Ishmaelite mode. What is it historically and metabolically that characterizes this Ishmaelite modality of God talk? Into an already highly conflicted world of Old and New Covenant, letter and spirit, synagogue and church, Islam, the path of Ishmael, intrudes in the 7th century as a new significant other, finally giving sense, it seemed, to the tale of Abraham's banishment of Ishmael and shaping European Christian selves and peoples into further reactive identities as non-Islamic, which will endure and prove their power even in core nationalist narratives of the 19th and 20th century, and even in some cases today. The rest of Europe's defining tension seemed to be binary. Reason in its engagement with revelation, the autochthonous intention with the Christian, Roman universalism in tension with local monarchies, but the relation between our monotheisms has, since the rise of Islam, been intensely and distinctively tripolar. Hence then, one might propose a neologism. All else that delivers European Western syntheses of the kind that philosophically today we have to engage with has been dialectical, but Hegel is transcended and even confounded by the addition in the 7th century of the Muslim other, so that perhaps we could use the term trialectic to fit this case. Europe has had not one but two consistent alterities. Christianity and its own theological sense of self has been shaped by its engagement with both, and they have both in turn had their periods of being shaped by it. As Christian theology reaches its Thomist climax, it both learns from but also emotionally brackets out both the two Semitisms which precede and succeeded. The rabbis, going back to Philo, and the Saracens, of whom Al-Ghazali is a significant, though for them Avicenized, exemplar. This trialectic might attempt engagement and find its outcomes by focusing on externals of ritual, of purity laws which patrol boundaries, and of other societal norms. But Abraham's three major sacralities all self-define as monotheistic, which is to say that their final form is taken to be not a form of life, but an idea. While the importance of theology has not been at all equal in these traditions, their engagement will most essentially invoke the realm of the abstract and conceptual. Monotheisms, unlike, for instance, most forms of traditional Hindu or Chinese religion, share the innovations of the period which Karl Jaspers called the axial age. Our theologies tend to emphasize the individual and individual accountability. They are, as we've seen, intensely ethics-oriented, even as a preface to the entire theological enterprise. And although they maintain rituals, human intentionality in those rituals becomes all-important. The axial age generated universal religious cultures through the act of turning within and self-scrutiny. Despite such apparently shared assumptions and the ability of such traditions to discuss abstractions and universals, they are also susceptible, of course, to the development of a mutual allergy, as the only God is habitually jealous of all others, including rival definitions of him. And this intersubjectivity of the monotheisms and their relationship to pagan antiquity which preceded them has done much to occlude the process of self-naughting and the transcendence of vainglory, which is the point with which we began. In the context of Kalam, the systematics of the final and decisive Abrahamic intellectuality, the accumulation of earlier paradigms militated against a simple dichotomizing between self and other. The interlocutors, dead but also alive, were simply too diverse in the cosmopolitan milieu of Baghdad and Khorasan in which Kalam had its crucible. Unlike modern Western philosophy, which dialogues only with itself or perhaps sometimes with the natural sciences, and unlike Christian scholasticism with its titanic struggle in Aquinas' time with Latin Averroism, Kalam faces many ways simultaneously, like Baghdad itself. Its polemics seriously entertain propositions from the diversity taxonomized, say, in Shahrastani's Milal wa Nihal. Refutation was needed not only of Aristotelian denials of creation, but also of various Christian incarnationisms, of Judaic denials of continuous prophecy and the possibility of post-Mosaic abrogation, and also Brahmanical and Buddhistic denials of prophecy itself. Kalam is intensely multiple in its focuses. This non-dichotomizing legacy may be seen as a paradigmatic challenge to the modern impasse in epistemology, which has resulted in the postmodern crisis of our culture, which comes about as a disillusion with over-reified dichotomies and binaries. Two always implies dichotomy. Three or more makes dichotomy less obvious and may open the possibility of mediation. Islam is part of the Abrahamic ternary, but has its optic focus to include antiquity and India as well. For Emmanuel Levinas, our culture must urgently retreat from the besetting sin of Europe, which he identifies as the tendency, driven by ancient chauvinisms, Greek binaries, and early modern science, to reify others as others, to be characterized and thereby controlled. For him, it is the mutual regard of the Christian and the Jewish, that was his context, which has been the most tragic paradigm, a rancorous pas de deux of ceaseless rivalry and contumacy, born of the belief that exegesis had attained a full definition and reduction in this binary opposition. The theologian's self-discipline must be ennobled by a non-binary relationality, however. For others, such as the gender alert, such as Lacan and Irigaray, and again here we see in gender studies this besetting European sin of the them and the us, the same and the other, a binary reduction. The most tragic of all binaries, in effect, born of knowledge of the other and the will to power, has been the male and the female. So much more than theorizing about the dichotomizing tendencies of Western thought has been done at the hands of gender alert thinkers. So whereas for Levinas, our besetting misfortune in Western intellectual culture has been the alleged basis of the letter-spirit dichotomy, for feminists it's been supplied by our response to the two modalities of gender. Both seem to force a dialectic whereby the other is either reduced to an alternative to the self, which was the Enlightenment project, or for the postmoderns affirmed as unknowable alterity. Attempts to overcome such binaries are legion. Most recently, for instance, they would include Daniel Boyarin's essay on Christianity as being not really different or an opposition to Judaism, but as a variant of it. And also some of the recent gender theories, which seek to challenge gender essences and propose a single human continuum lived in endless flux and renegotiation. Much of the West's current conversation is about breaking down that male-female dichotomy in favour of an individualistic set of forensic choices. In most such attempts, however, the resolution is sought either by turning the dialectic to new ends, so an old zero-sum game is just replaced by a new one, or by deconstructing its terms, or by reconstructing an ethical polemic such as, for instance, women against patriarchy. Very seldom is the possibility of opening it up to something non-dialectical, to our trialectic, or something even more plural with further antipodes entertained. Western thought remains trapped in the logic of two, of equivalencies or polarities. Could it be that the current disrespect into which current serious academic theology has fallen is due in part to this sense that under modern epistemological and plural conditions, the most convincing work is likely to be intuitive and unsystematic? An opportunistic exploiting of slippery convergences and epiphanies of intuitive recognition that may resemble the odd closeness which can appear between words and idioms in different languages. And this is the alternate, as it were, romanticizing alternative to the Kantian dialectics, which appears with Schleiermacher and a lot of other Christian theologians, that we break down this fierce, computational, reductionist approach through using something more affective. So in the context of Islamic studies, you might think of somebody like Louis Massignon, whose grasp of Islam was in many ways unrivaled, the greatest of the mustashriqeen, but actually based on a theology whereby he set up a juxtaposition between Islam and its Christian other, which seems to have been very unsystematic, informal, intuitive, even unscholarly, marked by a substantial reliance on informal types of non-verbal human solidarity and recognition during things like table fellowship, informal soirees, and joint pilgrimages of various kinds. Learning here becomes affective as well as factual. His conviction was that when religionists set aside the theories and their egos and consult their own deep intuition, they will find a self-verifying experience that communication is indeed possible, that one can transcend the logic of the same and the other. And although he refused to propose any kind of detailed theology of the kind that perhaps Kalam would want to account for this, possibly due to the inhibitions inherent in his pre-conciliar Catholic world, his entire work is grounded in the assumption of its feasibility. Massignon's conclusion was that a deep theologizing, experienced in joint interfaith pilgrimages, for instance, or in the sharing of scriptural texts, or in the investigation of symbolically rich and archetypal ideal figures, such as Al-Hallaj, can indeed be made academically public, the facilitator being the disciplined transcending of the ego and the insistence on ethical priorities and the recognition of the humanity of the other. The strength of this argument, still to some extent, I think has persuasive force, although mainstream Islamic studies still very much hesitates over the purposes of his major writings, which are seen as confessional or even mystical. In a religious world in which stasis and fixed positions have become the exception, our mobility, while part of the postmodern condition, seems often to confirm as well as to confound our ability to understand. The further horizon has also recently been opened to us. Not a few Muslims have sought to return to the ethical and self-aware principle in theology by entering the enterprise known as scriptural reasoning. The origins of this lie with post-Holocaust interrogations of liberal reason that found an inspiration in a return to styles of exposition that seemed able to yield an apparently fortuitous wisdom which promised an ethical outcome characterized by empathy rather than by dogmatic finality. People like David Novak and Peter Oakes have been among the pioneers of the more academic wing of this movement. Peter Oakes' work on the pragmatism of the American philosopher Charles Peirce, providing the earliest and to date probably most comprehensive philosophical foundation for the project, and Jewish, Christian and also Muslim theologians have found considerable energizing force in this. If you look at the online Journal of Scriptural Reasoning, you'll see there's a good number of Muslim theologians who are now publishing in that matrix. For Oakes, pragmatism, understood as an essentially introspective, self-knowing assessment of truth claims with an eye to their human entailments, helpfully acknowledges the force of positivism while not discounting metaphysics altogether. Despite Peirce's basically Victorian intellectual milieu, his approach to the logic of relations appears to speak directly to our contemporary needs, which are, to quote Oakes, a concern to find reasonably precise ways of talking about imprecise things without losing the meaning of the imprecision itself. A belief that phenomena of everyday language, including the everyday practices of religion, are among those things. A love of critical reasoning, but an acquired distrust of criticism that has lost sense of having a purpose. Disillusionment with modern or Enlightenment attempts to make a metaphysics and also a religion out of the rational critique of inherited traditions of knowledge and practice. A conviction that post-Enlightenment anti-rationalism, including romanticisms, emotivisms, and a variety of totalizing ideologies of power, history, experience, and so on, may prove logically to be the other side of the rationalist coin. Fascination with the irrevocable contextuality, temporal, historical, linguistic, social, biological, of rational judgments, but also with their persistent rationality. Although many Muslims are not comfortable with the exercise, for such thinkers of Muslim background, this scriptural reasoning enterprise seems to offer a new horizon of Kalam knowing. The currently regnant alternatives of a simple foundationalist hermeneutic that too easily collapses into implicit or explicit fundamentalism, or a Derridean deconstruction of Quran and Hadith which negates any characterization of the religion or its claims, are desolating. The Islamic world is seen as requiring a hermeneutic which accounts for the integrity of the text and recurrent patterns of interpretation, while conceding the impossibility of closure. The fundamentalist movements, currently so regnant in a Muslim world traumatized and unvalued by the identity crisis which we referred to earlier, are allergic to any type of provisionality. But the recentness of their determination to transform all of the zanni into the qat'i has been amply shown by Thomas Bauer in his recent book, The Culture of Ambiguity. Resistance to a culture of closure is in fact normative in Sunni Islam, beginning its decline, as he shows, only in the mid-19th century, a time when anxious Muslims sought clear and final answers in a new and hostile context, which they found profoundly threatening. There's another term which we might be able to repristinate here. A key element of much classical reflection on Islamic theology, which is ultimately an exercise in systematic scriptural exegesis, is described under the heading of futuwa, chivalry, denoting an ethos of extreme altruism in the inner jihad. Defined by John Renard as the substructure of Islam's spiritual path, its adherents, including its most salient thinker, Shihabuddin Omar Suhrawardi, dies in 1234, believe, and this is from Suhrawardi, if someone insults you, you should pray for him. If someone deprives you of something, give him something when he is in need. If someone severs his ties with you, adhere to him faithfully and never desert him. This is the true chivalry and manliness and the essence of God's word, the Quran. Suhrawardi's tradition, even though institutionally and conceptually at some distance from the Kalam, came to establish houses of chivalry in which this type of piety could be cultivated. The Quran's legalities and plain sense were not to be circumvented, problematized, or abolished, but should be subject to a hermeneutic which understands the book's purpose, which is to spread love. The Quran is the narrative of a human divine romance, so that Shamsi Tabriz calls it the Ishq-Nameh, the book of passion. A merely legal or philosophical eye will thus fail to do it justice and will reduce it to the genre of either law book or dogmatic monograph. Kalam without futuwa, in our holistic Ghazalian vision, will degenerate into doxological polemic. It's always been the besetting risk, the occupational hazard of doing Kalam, doxological polemic. However, a chivalric second reading of the text, driven by this understanding of a meta-context of divine compassion, allowed the houses of chivalry to search for lenient or concessory, wisdom-oriented interpretations of scriptural passages in order to avert what they believed to be an unintended strictness abhorrent to the divine purpose. One should only take fatwa from a master of futuwa, they used to say. Erudition is essential but insufficient to interpret the text and do theology according to the higher canon of mercy, of rahmah. This differs significantly from more standard fiqh discussions of rukhsa and azima, concession and strict application, which revolve around considerations of public interest, maslahah. Such an approach is not, properly speaking, a second reading, but a ameliorative first reading, since its perspective is essentially mundane and utilitarian. Despite its rootedness in classical Sharia theories of the discernibility of the divine purpose, its potential empowering of transparently subjective interpretations is evident. Futuwa seems close to pragmatist, ethical understandings of charitable rereading, in its unsystematic anticipation of unexpected convergences and possibilities. Given what we've said about the future of Kalam as necessarily receptive to an awareness of the givenness of the theologian, and the need for theory choices directed by an ethical soul, this principle seems a good category in which to frame our demand for a spiritual prelude to the theological quest. For the various Muslim thinkers who have shown increasing interest in the Persian turn, internal Islamic reifications in danger of collapse at the hands of rival Muslim interpretations may be evaluated by their sustainability in the context of Abrahamic collegiality, thus permitting a sort of return to the old culture of a welcome ambiguity. For Muslim hermeneutes, the Quranic context is believed to be particularly hospitable to a Persian pragmatism, given the profound ethicism and teleological thrust of the Quran itself. Ethical delivery and coherence towards other Muslim theologians and the monotheistic other allow one to recommence, but never conclude, the process of defining the normative, as in the Quran itself. Muslimness is partly to be figured as a complex response to a plurality of other paradigms. This possible retrieval of the older kalam and fiqh culture of permissible ambiguity and openness seems facilitated by the principle, which I alluded to earlier briefly, of the shared Semitic. There is perhaps something categoric, a final closure, implied by the Christian soteriology which Islam and Judaism have not been comfortable with. Yet Jakob Neusner's view that Islam and Judaism are integrally cognate types of religion is not uncontested. Notably, and in stark contrast, there is a tradition from Nietzsche and his followers which seems effectively to exclude Islam from the category of the Semitic, on the grounds that Islam, with its will to power, challenges the Semitic passivity and negativity which he thought was entailed in Jewish myths of the fall, in favour of an affirmation of the life principle. Where the Semitic appears receptive and feminine, its Promethean antithesis is active and male. Carlyle's very virile prophet as hero seems hewn from this vein, and the race theory of Sigrid Hunke is in some respects even more insistent. Jesus, on this view, is not really a man, he is an androgyne. Without hormones, he is inhuman, and this sickly detachment from body and world has denied man the fullness of life. In fact, for Nietzsche, Christianity, far from being a Greek and hence Aryan antithesis for the Semitic, a good foundation for a solid philosophical project, ironically partakes of a Judaic weakness, which it expresses in the particular form of celibacy and gospel pacifism, while Islam is an affirmative Semitic religion, or even more, a paragon of life-affirming values. That's Ian Alman's characterization. In his Antichrist, we learn that, this is Nietzsche, Christianity robbed us of the harvest of the culture of the ancient world. It later went on to rob us of the harvest of the culture of Islam. The wonderful Moorish cultural world of Spain, more closely related to us at bottom, speaking more directly to our senses and taste than Greece and Rome, was trampled down. Why? Because it had to thank noble and manly instincts for its origin, because it said yes to life, even to the rare and refined luxuriousness of Moorish life. The Crusades later made war on something before which it would have been even more fitting for them to have grovelled in the dust, a civilization beside which even that of our 19th century seems very poor and very senile. Christianity, on such a view, therefore, seems hardly capable of maintaining the kind of virile yet egoless ethical culture which Nietzsche sees as indispensable to proper philosophical work. Still, consider the rabbinical thinker Joseph Soloveitchik and his idea of the festive dignity of the man who is conformed faithfully to the details of a revealed law. This idea of the festive dignity of the jurist, and hence the theologian, his basic form of life, doesn't seem alien to the culture of the alim and his thesis of a legal recognition that no one knows God through the practice of the details of his law. The joyful recognition of God in a world made richly meaningful by his detailed commandments does, I would suggest, find a very real echo in Islamic piety. This is the case on the affective level, but other convergences to be reckoned with also, not least the significance of cognate languages with paradigmatically Hebrew and Arabic scriptures and terms which were both taken to be rooted in verbatim expressions of divine speech and which underline classically Jewish and Islamic theology and philosophy in a way which Christian theologians could not know. Mind, disconnected from body and culture, ends in deconstruction. Body, disconnected from mind, becomes perverse, smeared and twisted by something like some contemporary artists, Lucian Freud, smeared, distorted, perverted. The disconnection betrays sibling turns, that of Leibniz, who opened the doors to abolishing the function of the exterior world, and that of Locke, who anticipated more physicalist neuroscientists by emphasizing the mind's passivity. Neo-Kantians strove to overcome this gulf. But Muslim theism, Kalam, which has found it hard to sustain a mind-body dualism, has often sought to overcome it through reference not so much to rationality as such, aql, nazar, but as we've seen in this Ghazalian sense, the propedeutic of self-knowledge to a pre-rational intuition, the fitra, which allows us to link the mind directly to objects. The instrumentalizing of this link is the revealed law, Sharia, which begins with elementary bodily functions and ramifies into every dimension of life. Thus, the reality of the world is affirmed, the world is for us, but also its heterogeneity. Difference is real and to be affirmed because we know that the world merits different forms of Sharia access and address. The Sharia being our means of affirming the sacrality, the sign-like nature of the forms of creation. This body-world relation, which is the Sunnah, might well be seen as a sophisticated expression of what the philosopher Michael Bakhtin calls architectonics. For Bakhtin, in his critique of Western instrumental reason, the Enlightenment had not offered an adequate account of the manner by which we may negotiate the hiatus between perception of the self and perception of external entities. We see others from our own horizon, but radically homogenize them within a generic category of others. What is required is a mode of perception which obliges us to ground our perception of others in an awareness of their own mutual separation and distinctiveness. This in turn requires a proper acknowledgement of our own situatedness, particularly of our characteristic enfleshment within human bodies. Bakhtin's notion of architectonics appears to contribute to our vocabulary for a positive theistic critique of the larger weaknesses of Enlightenment reason, which nonetheless does open the way for the styles of a contemporary Kalam with its backdrop in spirituality and in a style of the spiritualization of the body. It seems to require not only an affirmation of the integrity of the other's act, but also a political act by the self to serve the other. The other is detected and valued through architectonic apprehension and must be actively defended. Every human being has an innate right. Here Bakhtin is far from Heidegger, who shared his strong sense of the defeat of scientific optimism during the Great War, but whose system seemed to valorize an affirmation of selfhood through the mere fact of decision-taking. So that, as Karl Jaspers described Heidegger's position, the manner of thinking was more important than the content of political judgments. Dangerous. Bakhtin offers a system that seems to be much more congenial to a Kalam perspective, making this kind of idolatry of the will much more difficult, and returning us perhaps to the Ghazalian insistence on the epistemological primacy of the ethical. Similarly committed to social and political activism grounded in a rejection of dualism is Maurice Merleau-Ponty. There's been a revival of interest amongst philosophers in Merleau-Ponty's work in the last few years. Like Bakhtin, he appreciates the contemporary concern with self-awareness and wishes to affirm its bodily quality. His concept of the body subject seeks to defeat Enlightenment dualism without conceding any ground to behaviorism. Body and mind are not a composite of two principles, one of which is simply a part of a material network of causality, while the other, incarnated somehow within it, comprises a sovereign but moral agent of perception. Instead, the body subject is a single entity with the self existing as the highest modality of the fully integrated phenomenon that is the body subject. The spiritual is real and is not reducible simply to the physical. Nonetheless, it is an aspect of it. Without the body, we do not exist. This kind of body-mind integration, so congenial to, as it were, the Semitic way of doing theology, thus seems to be the polar opposite of Enlightenment valorizations, framed against a certain image of Christianity, of both body and mind. Although in rejecting an obsession with guilt and sin and eremiticism, the Enlightenment revalorized the body, but this did not take place through a ressourcement in the despised Semitisms. The 18th century philosophe didn't go back to Jewish law, but through a very different return to what might be described as essentially pagan classical conceptions. Unlike the Semites, the philosophe ended up not knowing really what to do with the body other than heal it or make it stronger, return to classical ideas and the beginning of the cult of sport in Western Europe. The Semitisms, however, while generally rejecting the public cult of the body, had always been attuned to its functions, each of which was integrated into the human subject through complex webs of conscious intention, niyya, or in the Jewish context, kavanah, and comprehensive sharia practice. Let me just fast forward to my conclusion, because I think that it would be good to hear your questions. Essentially what I've been talking about has been ways in which certain contemporary turns in Western philosophy, particularly the return to the idea of the communitarian principle, the basis from which we do philosophy, our embeddedness in a particular form or world, and also at least Foucault's lament that no longer does our form or world predicate itself upon the premise of self-abnegation, Ghazalian turn within. But essentially I have been referring to the problem of the ego, or the selfhood of the subject. The subjectivity of the typical antithesis, this besetting sin, as Levinas would see it, of the European project, has attracted numerous criticisms, and not just from Levinas, but from people like Popper as well. The sublation seems entirely dependent on the choice of counter-argument, and hence appears as culturally determined and unfixed. A frequent plurality of antitheses, alternate or plural second readings of a scriptural text, sometimes can seem only to exacerbate the problem. It seems to be assumed that the mind can offer and select such readings in a stable way, and in general Enlightenment definitions of the human subject, once prevalent in disciplines such as Islamic studies, assume that the academic may interpret texts, and even Clifford Geertz's moods and motivations, in a fixed fashion, by deploying his or her status as a learned scholar subject. This fixity is already implicitly undermined by Hegel's own vague use of sublation, which seems to imply abolition and advancement simultaneously. More recently, this ambiguity about the precision of the human subject has been sharpened, as we began to worry, in Robert Pippin's words, whether the assumption of such a free, rational, reflective, irresponsible individual subject is warranted. Now, this is the next step beyond postmodernism, of course, the denial of the existence of the self. First we deny the other, and hence deny the possibility of a philosophy based on relationality, and then we deny the existence of the self, which seems to be where a lot of modern neuroscience is moving. So this crisis of subjectivity has called not just theology, but all the humanities into profound question, and disciplines such as the history of philosophy and Islamic studies, historically citadels of reification based on supposedly scientific methods determined by a regnant and objective Western mind, are particularly effective. Abrahamic religions, however, usually share a belief in an afterlife preceded by physical resurrection. They thus tend to converge on a view that body and consciousness are, as we've seen, closely interrelated. The Semitisms particularly convinced that the basis of human knowledge is connected to the body, which is the foundation of the human subject, the mediator by which we know the world, which also ineluctably shapes our perceptions of the world. So for one rabbi, from the physical we perceive the spiritual. In Islam, Ghazalian, Sufi and Futuwa traditions have also often emphasized a body-spirit integrity, while the soul, of course in Kalam, is typically regarded as a physical thing, physically coterminous with the body. While Christianity, as we've seen, has often developed quasi-dualistic accounts of the relation, and has at times evinced skepticism over the value of the body, it has hardly neglected the partial reliance of mental states on bodily conditions. Asceticism is not the only way the body may be religiously employed. We've indicated a few minutes ago that this seems to enable a partial escape from deconstruction, seen as a neglect of the relative constancy of our embodiment, biology as a single discipline, and pointed to sacred law as a nexus which might establish a stable connection between consciousness, defined by pietists as right intention, niyya, or attention, hudur, and the body and its functions, maybe even what today would popularly be referred to as mindfulness, the attempt to bring together the body, the mind, the spirit, which are three attributes of the human composite which in the conditions of late modernity seem to be flying apart in such a threatening way. And for Islam, this explains the centrality of the hadith and nawafil, the hadith text in which conscious obedience to the law ends up yielding direct knowledge of God. Thus the reality of the world is affirmed, but also its heterogeneity. Difference is real and to be affirmed. So Soloveitchik's explication of this, his idea of a legal recognition, the recognition of the divine through our intersubjectivity as members of a community bound together by revealed law, also provides, it seems, and again I think this is the final Ghazalian insight, the necessary beginning for a philosophical project that will not, as so many recent projects have done, collapse upon itself, claiming to enable not only a real human intersubjectivity through my embodiment and through the connection of the body to the spirit through practices of intention and the right deployment of the body in Sharia compliance and faithfulness, a real human intersubjectivity is enabled, but also to the possibility of an intuitive transcendence and the taking of theory choices, even in the strictest forms of kalam, based on a transformed selfhood. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.